The heart monitor was slowing down again. Damian Blackwood stood over his son's bed with his fists pressed against the mattress, watching the small chest rise and fall with less strength than it had yesterday. And yesterday had been worse than the day before. 3 doctors stood behind him in the Royal Medical Wing, and not one of them would meet his eyes. That silence told him everything, before a single word was spoken. His son Leo was 5 years old. He should have been running through the palace gardens, chasing birds, laughing so loudly the guards would smile behind their serious faces. Instead, the boy lay pale and still under white sheets, his golden hair damp against his forehead, his little hands cold no matter how many blankets they wrapped around him. Dr. Hale finally cleared his throat. He was the oldest healer in the territory, a man who had served the Blackwood family for 40 years, and his voice shook as he spoke. He said they had tried everything, every treatment known to their people, every medicine from the human hospitals in the city, every old remedy written in the ancient books. Nothing worked. The boy's body was shutting down, one system at a time, and there was no explanation for it, no infection they could find, no injury, no known disease. It was as if something invisible was pulling the life out of him drop by drop. Damian did not turn around. His voice came out low and dangerous. He asked how long. Dr. Hale hesitated, and that hesitation was crueler than any answer. Then he said it. Weeks, maybe less. He said he was sorry. He said the word sorry 3 times, as if repeating it could soften what it meant, and then he suggested that the king begin preparing himself. Preparing himself. Damian almost laughed at the phrase, except nothing had been funny for 2 years, not since his wife Elena had died in this same wing, in a bed just down the hall, fading in almost the same slow and unexplainable way. The doctors had no answers then either. They called it a rare blood condition. They called it tragic. They wrote it in their files and closed the folder, and Damian had buried his wife on a cold morning in October, while his 3-year-old son held his hand and asked when Mama was coming back. Now the same shadow had come for Leo. Damian turned around, and the 3 doctors stepped back without meaning to. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and gray eyes that people said could freeze a river. He was the Alpha King of the Blackwood territory, the strongest pack in the region, ruler of thousands, feared by his enemies, and respected even by those who hated him. He had faced down rival packs, survived 2 attempts on his life, and rebuilt his territory after the border wars. And none of it mattered, because his power could not do the one thing he needed. It could not save a sick little boy. He told the doctors to get out. They left quickly, and Damian sat down in the chair beside the bed, the chair where he had spent almost every night for the past 4 months. He took his son's small hand in his own. Leo's eyes fluttered open, just barely, and the boy managed a tiny smile. He asked if Papa was staying tonight. Damian said yes. He said he was staying every night. He kept his voice steady because his son needed it steady, but inside his chest, something was tearing apart, slowly, the way rope tears when the weight is too heavy. Leo whispered that he had a dream about Mama. He said she was standing in a field of yellow flowers, and she told him to hold on. He asked his father what she meant by that. Hold on to what? Damian could not answer. He just squeezed the small hand gently and told his son to rest. When the boy finally drifted back to sleep, Damian stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was sharp and cold. Below him, the palace grounds stretched out in the moonlight, and beyond the walls, the lights of the town glittered like scattered coins. Somewhere out there, thousands of his people were living their ordinary lives, cooking dinner, arguing about small things, tucking healthy children into bed. He would have traded his crown, his territory, his own life, for one ordinary night like that. His beta, Marcus, found him there an hour later. Marcus was the closest thing Damian had to a friend, a solid man with a scarred jaw and calm brown eyes, loyal since they were boys. He stood beside his king in silence for a long moment before he spoke. He said he had heard what the doctors said. Then he said something Damian did not expect. He said maybe they had been looking in the wrong places. The doctors, the hospitals, the specialists, they were all official channels. But there were other kinds of healers in the world, old bloodlines, gifts that did not appear in any medical book. Most of the stories were nonsense, he admitted, rumors and fairy tales. But some of the stories kept coming back, year after year, from different mouths in different towns, and stories that consistent usually had a seed of truth inside them. Damian asked what kind of stories. Marcus told him about a rumor moving through the eastern edge of the territory. A story about a woman in the town of Millbrook. People said she could take away pain with her hands. A trucker with a crushed shoulder swore she touched him once, and the bones knit straight. An old woman claimed her failing eyes cleared after the stranger held her face for a minute in the back room of a diner. Nobody knew who the woman was. She never gave her name. Witnesses said she begged people not to talk about it, which of course made them talk about it more. Damien stared out at the dark horizon. 2 years ago, he would have dismissed it instantly. He was not a man who believed in miracles. Miracles had not saved his wife. But desperation changes the math inside a man's head. When the official answer is that your child will die, any other answer starts to look worth chasing. He told Marcus to find her. Marcus nodded and turned to go, but Damien caught his arm. He added one more thing, and his voice was quiet and hard. He said no one else could know. Not the council, not the doctors, not the staff. If word spread that the king was chasing folktales, his enemies would smell weakness, and there were people inside these walls he no longer trusted. He had felt it for months, a wrongness he could not name, eyes that watched too closely, conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Marcus asked if he really believed someone inside the palace was a danger. Damien looked back through the glass doors at his sleeping son, so small in that big white bed, and he said something that had been sitting in his gut like a stone ever since the boy first fell ill. He said healthy children do not simply start dying for no reason, and wives do not either. Marcus went still. He understood what the king was suggesting, and the weight of it settled over both men like a dropped net. If Damien was right, then the enemy was not some invisible disease. The enemy had a face, and hands, and access to the palace. The enemy had already taken Elena, and now the enemy was taking Leo, and the doctors would keep finding nothing, because there was nothing natural to find. Marcus swore he would leave for Millbrook before sunrise. He swore he would find the woman if she existed. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the stone corridor, and Damien stood alone on the balcony, with the cold wind cutting through his shirt. He went back inside and sat beside the bed. The monitor beeped its slow, fragile rhythm. Leo stirred in his sleep and murmured something too soft to hear. Damien leaned close to his son's ear and made a promise. He said he did not care what it cost. He did not care what he had to do, who he had to face, or how far he had to go. He was not going to lose him. Not like this. Not the way he lost the boy's mother, standing helpless while the light went out. Outside the window, far to the east, the town of Millbrook slept under the same cold moon. In a small rented room above a laundromat, a young waitress named Grace Bennett woke suddenly from a nightmare, with her heart pounding, her palms burning with a strange warmth she had spent her whole life trying to hide. She stared at her hands in the darkness, and felt, without knowing why, that something enormous was coming for her. She was right. Grace had been running for 3 years, running from a past she never talked about, from a pack that had treated her like a tool instead of a person, from a gift that had brought her nothing but trouble since the day her grandmother first pressed those small hands between her own and whispered that they carried something ancient and rare. Heal quietly, her grandmother had warned her. Heal only when you must. The moment powerful people learn what you can do, child, you will stop being a person to them. You will become a thing they want to own. Grace had learned how true that warning was, in the worst possible way. So she stayed small. She stayed invisible. She poured coffee at Rosie's diner on the highway, smiled at truckers and tired families, collected her tips, and told no one anything. She never used her real last name. She never let anyone take her picture. She moved every year, sometimes sooner, whenever the feeling of being watched crawled up the back of her neck. But 3 weeks ago, she had made a mistake. Her coworker Danny had slipped in the kitchen and pressed his forearm against the flat grill. The smell, the scream, the sight of him white-faced and shaking on the floor tiles, it had cut through every rule she lived by. Before she could stop herself, her hands were on his arm, and the warmth was flowing, and the terrible burn was fading to smooth pink skin, while Danny stared at her like she was made of light. She had begged him to keep quiet. He had promised. But there had been a customer at the counter that night, a thin man nursing his third coffee, and Grace had caught him watching through the kitchen pass with wide, hungry eyes. Now, lying awake in the dark above the laundromat, Grace felt the old alarm ringing in her bones. Time to run again. First light, she told herself. Pack the bag. Empty the coffee tin of savings. Leave no note. She had done it before. She could do it again. She did not know that she was already too late. She did not know that her name, her face, and the story of the burned arm were already traveling west along the highway, passed from mouth to mouth, growing larger with every telling, until it reached the ears of the most powerful man in the territory. She did not know that a scarred beta was loading a black vehicle in the palace garage at that very moment, or that a dying little boy with golden hair was dreaming of yellow flowers, holding on, just as his mother had told him to. All Grace knew was the burning in her palms and the fear in her chest. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, and in the last drifting moment before dreams took her, she heard her grandmother's voice, soft and impossibly clear, saying words the old woman had said only once, on the night she died. "One day, child, the gift will ask you for everything, and on that day, you will find out who you really are." Grace never got the chance to run. She was halfway through stuffing clothes into her worn canvas bag when the knock came. 3 firm strikes against her door at 6 in the morning, and every muscle in her body turned to ice. Nobody knocked on her door. Nobody knew where she lived. She had made sure of that. She stood frozen in the middle of the small room, the bag hanging from her hand, and for one wild second she considered the window. 2 floors down to the alley. She had jumped from worse. Then a voice came through the door, calm and low, a man's voice, and it said the one thing that stopped her cold. It said he was not here to hurt her, and he was not from Silas. That name went through her like a blade. She had not heard it spoken aloud in 3 years. She had built her entire life around never hearing it again. Whoever stood outside her door knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was running from, and that meant running was already pointless. She opened the door with her heart slamming against her ribs. The man in the hallway was big, dressed in plain dark clothes that could not hide what he was. She knew the look, the stillness, the awareness, the quiet power rolling off him like heat off pavement. A high-ranking wolf, and not from any pack around here. He had a scar along his jaw and tired eyes, and he kept his hands visible at his sides, which she recognized as a deliberate courtesy. He introduced himself as Marcus, Beta of the Blackwood Pack. Grace felt the floor tilt slightly. Blackwood, the royal pack. The Alpha King's own people, standing in her crooked hallway above a laundromat, looking at her like she mattered. She told him he had the wrong person. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She said she was just a waitress. Marcus did not argue. He simply reached into his jacket, slowly, and took out a photograph, and held it out to her. Grace did not want to look at it. Looking at it would make whatever this was real. But her eyes dropped anyway, and what she saw drove the air out of her lungs. It was a little boy. 5, maybe 6 years old, with golden hair and enormous gray eyes, lying in a hospital bed that made him look even smaller than he was. Tubes ran along his thin arms. His skin had the grayish shade Grace had seen before, years ago, in her grandmother's final weeks, the color of a body, losing its argument with death. But it was the boy's expression that broke something open in her chest. He was smiling for the camera, weak, exhausted, fading, and still trying to smile so that whoever held the camera would not be sad. Marcus spoke quietly. He said the boy's name was Leo. He was the Alpha King's only child. His mother was dead. The finest doctors in the territory and the human cities had all surrendered. They gave him weeks. Marcus said he had driven through the night on nothing but a rumor and a prayer, because a trucker in a roadside bar had told a story about a waitress in Millbrook who fixed a burned arm with her bare hands. Grace's fingers trembled around the photograph. She hated Danny for talking. She hated the thin man at the counter with his hungry eyes. She hated the trucker and the bar, and the whole chain of loose mouths that had led this man to her door. And underneath all that anger, she hated the pull she already felt toward the dying child in the picture, because that pull was going to ruin her carefully built invisible life, and she knew it. She handed the photograph back, and said she was sorry about the boy, truly sorry. But she could not help him. Marcus asked why not. Because, she said, and then she stopped, because the real answer was a tangle of fear and history too heavy to hand to a stranger, because healing small wounds was one thing, but what he was asking for was something else entirely. Because the deeper the sickness, the more the healing took from her, and something that could kill a child from the inside might kill her too if she tried to pull it out. Because the last time powerful wolves discovered what she could do, they locked her behind pack walls and used her like a battery, until she barely remembered her own name, because her grandmother had died protecting this secret, and walking into a royal palace and performing miracles in front of an alpha king was the exact opposite of a secret. What she actually said was simpler. She said that people like her did not survive being useful to people like him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect from a royal beta. He sat down, right there on the top step of the dusty staircase, like a tired, ordinary man, and he told her about the king. He said Damian Blackwood had watched his wife die 2 years ago of the same slow fading, and the man had never recovered, not really. He said the king slept in a chair beside his son's bed every night. He said that 3 days ago, the doctors gave their final answer, and that night, Marcus had found his king, standing on a balcony, looking down at the stones below in a way that frightened him. He said the boy was all the man had left, and the man was all the boy had left, and the whole kingdom could feel the darkness gathering over the palace like weather. Then Marcus stood, brushed off his trousers, and said the words that decided everything. He said he was not here to force her. No guards were coming. No one would drag her anywhere. He had told the king that if the woman said no, then the answer was no. But he asked her to understand one thing before she gave that answer. Somewhere, right now, a 5-year-old boy was holding his father's hand, trying to be brave for him, asking whether it would hurt, the thing that was coming. And she might be the only person alive who could take that question away. He placed a plain white card with a phone number on the windowsill by the door, nodded to her with real respect, and walked down the stairs. She heard the street door open and close. She heard an engine start, then fade. Grace stood in the doorway of her small rented room for a long time. She made coffee she did not drink. She finished packing the bag, and then unpacked it, and then packed it again. She told herself all the reasons, and they were good reasons, real ones, carved out of scars. She had escaped Silas and his pack with nothing but the clothes she wore, and a body so drained from forced healings that she had collapsed twice on the highway. She had promised herself, kneeling on the gravel shoulder of that road at dawn, that no one would ever use her again. Walking into the seat of royal power was madness. Kings did not let miracles walk away. Whatever kindness lived in that beta's tired eyes, the machinery of power had its own logic, and that logic always ended the same way for people like her. Owned, caged, emptied. And yet, the photograph would not leave her head. Not the tubes, not the gray skin. The smile, that brave, exhausted little smile, aimed at a grieving father to protect him. Grace knew that smile from the inside. She had worn it herself at 11 years old, sitting beside her grandmother's bed, smiling so the dying woman would not worry about the child she was leaving behind. At Rosie's diner that afternoon, she dropped a plate for the first time in a year. She poured coffee into a cup that was already full. Rosie, the owner, a round, warm woman with flour permanently on her apron, took one look at her face and asked who died. Grace flinched so hard that Rosie's teasing smile disappeared, and the older woman quietly told her to take the evening off. Grace walked. She walked past the laundromat, past the gas station, out along the edge of the highway, where the fields opened up and the sky turned orange and gold. She thought about her grandmother's warning. The moment powerful people learn what you can do, you will stop being a person to them. Every year of her life had proven those words true. But she thought about the other thing too, the last thing, spoken through papery lips on a winter night. One day, the gift will ask you for everything. Her grandmother had not said run from that day. She had not said hide from it. She had said, on that day, you will find out who you really are. Grace stood at the edge of a field as the sun went down, and she asked herself the question she had been dodging since 6 o'clock that morning. If she got on a bus tonight and disappeared, the way she had disappeared from 3 towns before this one, who exactly would she be then? She would be safe, she would be free, and somewhere behind her, a small boy with golden hair would slip away in a white bed, and his father would break, and Grace would carry that photograph in her head for the rest of her hidden little life, knowing she had the water, and watch the fire burn anyway. Her hands were warm. They had been warm all day, warmer than they had ever been, as if the gift itself were leaning toward the east, toward the palace, toward the fading heartbeat it somehow already knew was there. It was full dark when she climbed the stairs back to her room. The white card sat on the windowsill, exactly where Marcus had left it, pale as a moth in the gloom. Grace picked it up and turned it over in her fingers, and she felt the whole weight of her old promises pressing down on her. Every scar, every warning, every mile of highway she had put between herself and the last people who knew her name. Then she saw the boy's smile again. She dialed the number before her fear could finish its sentence. Marcus answered on the first ring, as if he had been sitting with the phone in his hand for 12 hours, and Grace heard her own voice, strange and steady, laying down her terms. One visit, one examination of the child, no promises beyond that. No one at the palace learns her full name or where she came from. No records, no photographs, no announcements. The moment anyone tried to hold her, she was gone, and they would never find her again. Marcus agreed to every word without hesitation. Then he said the car would come at dawn, and thanked her in a voice gone rough, and Grace hung up and stood in the dark little room that had been her whole safe world, understanding with perfect clarity that she had just set fire to it. Far to the west, in the Royal Medical Wing, Leo Blackwood opened his eyes at that exact moment and told the nurse, with dreamy certainty, that the lady from Mama's field was coming. The nurse smiled sadly and smoothed his hair and wrote it in the chart as confusion. It was the only thing in that chart that was true. The black car crossed the palace gates just after 9 in the morning, and Grace's first thought was that she had made a terrible mistake. The walls were higher than any building in Millbrook. Guards stood at every corner, and every one of them turned to look at the vehicle as it passed, and she could feel their attention like fingers pressing on the back of her neck. 3 years of hiding, and she had just driven straight into the most watched place in the territory. Marcus sat beside her in the back seat. He had kept his word so far. No convoy, no escort, just one plain car and one quiet driver. He had even brought her coffee for the road, black with 2 sugars, and she had not asked how he knew how she took it, because the answer was obvious and unsettling. They had been watching the diner. Of course they had. The palace itself was old gray stone softened by ivy, larger than she had imagined and colder than she had feared. Staff moved through the corridors with lowered eyes and hushed voices, and Grace realized within 30 seconds that this was a house holding its breath. Grief hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the building already knew how the story of the little prince was supposed to end, and they were all quietly bracing for it. Marcus led her up a wide staircase and down a long hall, and then a door opened ahead of them, and Grace met the Alpha King. She had expected a crown, or at least the polished costume of power. Instead, she saw a man in a wrinkled gray shirt with 2 days of stubble, and the eyes of someone who had forgotten what sleep felt like. He was tall, taller than Marcus, built like the soldiers who sometimes passed through the diner, and even exhausted he filled the corridor with a pressure she could feel on her skin. This was what a king was, she understood. Not the clothes, the gravity. He looked at her, and his gray eyes went from her face, to her waitress's plain jacket, to her second-hand shoes, and something in his expression shifted, and Grace watched hope die in the man, in real time. He had been praying for a miracle, and they had brought him a tired young woman from a highway diner. His first words were not a greeting. He asked Marcus, flatly, if this was a joke. The unfairness of it stung more than it should have. Grace had given up her safety, her hiding place, possibly her freedom, to stand in this cold hallway, and this man was looking at her like a delivery that had arrived damaged. 3 years of swallowing her words in front of powerful wolves came to a sudden end. She heard herself answer before Marcus could, and her voice came out sharp as broken glass. She said she had a warm bed and a quiet life 200 miles east of here, and she had left both behind for a child she had never met. So if the king wanted to sneer at somebody, he could sneer at his doctors, because they were the ones who had failed, not her. And if he preferred, she would happily turn around and go home. The corridor went absolutely silent. Marcus had stopped breathing. Somewhere down the hall, a maid froze with a stack of linens in her arms. Nobody spoke to Damien Blackwood that way. Nobody had in years. The king stared at her for a long, dangerous moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger, something older and more surprised, like a man hearing a language he had forgotten he knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, but the mockery was gone from it. He said the doctors held degrees and 40 years of experience. He asked what exactly she held. Grace held up her 2 open hands, work rough, chapped from washing dishes, and said the only true thing she could. These. Take them or leave them. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, or the desperation, or the fact that no doctor with a degree had anything left to offer. The king turned without another word and pushed open the door to his son's room, and that was his answer. The medical wing smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something faint and wrong that only Grace seemed to notice, a smell like cold metal and dying flowers. Machines beeped softly, and in the middle of it all, in a bed far too big for him, lay the boy from the photograph. Leo was worse than the picture. The gray shade had deepened. His breathing was shallow and quick, like a bird's. But when Grace stepped through the door, the boy's eyes opened, and he looked directly at her, past Marcus, past his own father, straight at her face, and his cracked lips curved into a smile of pure recognition. He said, in a voice like paper, that she was the lady. The lady from the yellow field. Mama said she would come. Grace stopped walking. She had never seen this child in her life. But standing there under his certain gaze, she felt the strangest sensation, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was inside her. Behind her, she heard the king's breath catch, and she understood that the words meant something to him too, something that hurt. She sat down on the edge of the bed, moving slowly, and asked Leo if she could hold his hand. He gave it willingly. His fingers were cold and light as twigs. The moment their skin touched, the gift woke. It had never come on this strong before. Warmth poured down her arms into her palms so fast it was almost painful, and her senses opened, and suddenly she could feel the inside of the boy's body, the way other people feel the weather. She closed her eyes and let the knowing spread, and what she found made her stomach clench with cold horror. The doctors were not incompetent. They had searched for a disease, and there was no disease to find. What lived in this child was not sickness. It was a substance. She could feel it laced through his blood like black thread through white cloth, gathered in his liver, coating his small lungs, wound around the bright silver core of him where his wolf slept, pinning it down so it could not rise and fight. Wolfsbane, refined, concentrated, and bound to powdered silver so fine it slipped through every filter in his body. This was not something a child could touch by accident. This was crafted, measured, administered slowly, in small doses, over months, by a patient hand. Someone was poisoning the little prince. Someone inside these walls had been doing it for a long time, and with a second wave of understanding that nearly made her sway, Grace realized what the faint wrong smell in this room really was, and why the boy's mother had faded the same way in a bed down the hall. Whoever held the poison had done this before. The queen had not died of any rare blood condition. She had been murdered, slowly, in front of doctors who never thought to look for a weapon instead of an illness. Grace opened her eyes. The king was watching her from the foot of the bed with terrible intensity, and Marcus stood by the door, and a nurse was arranging bottles on a tray in the corner, and through the window she could see 2 council members walking in the courtyard below. Any of them. It could be any of them. The truth sat on her tongue like a live coal, and every instinct she owned screamed at her to swallow it. She was a stranger here, with no name and no protection. If she announced poison in this room, in this palace, the poisoner would know within the hour that she knew. People who murder queens and children do not leave loose threads walking around. And there was worse. If she spoke and was believed, she would be pulled into the center of a royal investigation, questioned, documented, exposed. If she spoke and was not believed, she might be blamed. A nameless drifter with strange powers, alone in the prince's room, is a gift to anyone hunting for a scapegoat. So Grace made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. She lied to a king. She told Damien that his son's condition was grave but not hopeless. She said she could feel the wrongness in him, something the machines could not see, and she believed she could draw it out, slowly, over many sessions. She said it would take weeks. She did not say the word poison. She did not look at the nurse or the tray of bottles. She kept her face smooth and her voice level, and inside she began building a plan with hands she could not let anyone see shaking. She would heal the boy quietly, dose by dose, undoing the poisoner's work faster than it could be redone. And while she did it, she would watch. Every nurse, every servant, every visitor, every cup of water that entered this room, the poisoner would keep poisoning, because as far as they knew, nothing had changed. Sooner or later, in front of her open senses, they would reach the boy with death in their hand, and Grace would be watching when they did. The king asked her, in a voice stripped of all its armor, if she was telling him his son could live. Grace looked at Leo, who was still holding her hand, still smiling at her, like she was made of morning light, and she made the second promise of her life, that had no exit built into it. She said yes, he could live, but she had conditions, and they were not negotiable. She would stay in the palace, in a room beside this one. No one but the king, Marcus, and the boy, was to know what she really did in this room. To everyone else, she was a specialist nurse, nothing more. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was to be given to Leo. No food, no water, no medicine, unless it passed through her hands first. Damien frowned at that last condition, and for a moment his eyes sharpened, and she could see the intelligence behind the grief, see him almost catch the shape of what she was not saying. But he was a drowning man being offered a rope, and drowning men do not interrogate the rope, he agreed. That evening, in her small new room beside the prince's, Grace stood at the window and watched the sun go down over the palace walls. Somewhere in this beautiful cold building, a murderer was moving through the halls, wearing a friendly face, carrying keys, saying goodnight to guards, patiently killing a 5-year-old boy the same way they had killed his mother. They did not know she existed. They did not know that everything had just changed. Down the hall, Leo slept, and for the first time in 4 months, his fever had dropped by 1/2 degree. The war had begun. Only one side knew it. The first healing session nearly broke her. Grace waited until midnight, when the palace finally went quiet, and the night nurse could be sent away on an errand. And then she sat beside Leo's bed, placed both hands over his small chest, and went to work on the black threads. Drawing out poison was nothing like closing a burn. A burn was surface work, quick and clean. This was like pulling 1,000 tiny fishhooks out of living cloth, one at a time, without tearing anything. The wolfsbane fought her. The silver dust clung. Every thread she gathered had to be drawn through her own hands, through her own body, and burned away by the gift. And each one left her a little colder, a little grayer, a little further from the surface of herself. After 2 hours, she had cleared perhaps a fingernail's worth of the darkness, and she stumbled back to her room, fell onto the bed fully dressed, and slept like the dead until noon. But Leo woke that morning and asked for toast. The nurse nearly dropped her tray. The boy had not asked for food in 6 weeks. He ate half a slice, complained that it needed more butter, and slept again, and the complaint traveled through the palace staff like electricity, because dying children do not complain about butter. Complaining about butter is what living children do. Grace built a rhythm after that. Sessions every night, sometimes twice, always behind a locked door, with Marcus standing guard in the corridor, pretending to be a board security officer. Days were for recovery, and for her other work, the secret work, the watching. She had taken over every detail of Leo's care, exactly as agreed. She prepared his meals herself, in the small kitchen attached to the medical wing. She poured his water from bottles she chose at random from the palace stores. She examined every medicine before it reached him, and most of them she quietly poured away, because his body needed no more chemicals. It needed emptiness and time. And within 4 days, she found the first proof. It was in the vitamin tonic. A cheerful amber syrup, prescribed months ago, delivered weekly from the palace pharmacy, spooned into the prince's mouth every evening by whichever nurse was on duty. Grace held the bottle in her bare hands, opened her senses, and felt the cold metallic wrongness singing through the sweetness, like a wire through honey. Wolfsbane and silver, expertly blended, at a dose calculated to fade a child slowly enough that no doctor would ever suspect a single event. She stood alone, in the small kitchen, holding the pretty bottle of death, and her hands shook, not with fear this time, but with a rage so pure it frightened her. She said nothing. She poured the tonic down the drain each evening, refilled the bottle with harmless syrup she made herself, and put it back exactly where it lived. The poisoner's schedule would continue, the poisoner's confidence would continue, and the poisoner's weapon was now candy. Leo bloomed like spring. By the 2nd week, the gray shade had left his skin. By the 3rd, he was sitting up for hours, demanding stories, beating Marcus at card games, and accusing him of letting him win, which Marcus solemnly denied, while obviously letting him win. His laugh came back, a bright, ridiculous giggle that could stop staff in the corridors mid-step. The doctors ran their tests, found improvement they could not explain, and wrote the word remarkable in his chart so many times it stopped meaning anything. Dr. Hale wept openly in the hallway and called it a miracle. The palace, which had been holding its breath for months, slowly began to breathe, and the king began to appear. At first Damien came only at night, standing in the doorway during her sessions, silent and unreadable, watching Grace pour herself out over his son. Then he started arriving earlier. Then he stayed later. He brought coffee without being asked, black with 2 sugars, and did not explain how he knew. And Grace did not ask. And something about the small repeated kindness undid her more than grand gestures ever could have. They talked, in the quiet hours while Leo slept. Carefully at first, like 2 people crossing ice. He asked about healing, and she gave him honest answers about everything except the poison. She asked about Elena, expecting him to close like a door, but instead, he talked, haltingly, and then like a dam giving way. His wife had been warm where he was cold, quick to laugh, terrible at chess and unbothered by it. She used to take Leo to a meadow east of the palace every summer, a field that turned solid yellow with wildflowers, and Grace felt the hair rise on her arms, because she had never told anyone what Leo said about the lady from the yellow field, and she was quite sure Damien was thinking of it too. One night she fainted. She had pushed too deep, drawn too much of the darkness in one session, and the room tilted, and the floor came up, and she woke on the couch by the window, with the Alpha King of the Blackwood territory kneeling beside her, holding her wrist, his face stripped of every royal thing, and filled with plain human fear. He told her, in a voice she had never heard from him, that she was to stop. Whatever she was doing, however she was doing it, no more, not at this cost. His son would not be saved by watching someone else fade in his place. He had seen enough fading for one lifetime. Grace, still dizzy, told him she was fine, and he said, with sudden roughness, that she was a terrible liar, and that he had buried people he loved, and knew what giving too much looked like. The sentence sat between them in the lamplight, and neither of them touched it, and both of them understood that something had shifted, and there was no shifting it back. After that, he made rules. Sessions were shortened. Meals were sent to her room, absurd towering meals, as if the royal kitchen had been ordered to fatten her for winter. When she walked the gardens for air, she would find him accidentally walking the same paths, and Leo, sharp as a blade even at 5, began arranging things, demanding that Papa and Miss Grace both sit with him for stories, both hold his hands, both stay until he slept, and then peeking through his lashes at the 2 of them sitting on either side of his bed like matched bookends. It was, Grace thought, the strangest and most dangerous happiness of her life, because underneath every warm evening, the Second War went on. She watched. She learned the palace the way she had once learned highway towns, mapping who moved where and when. She noted which staff had access to the pharmacy. She noted that the weekly tonic deliveries were logged by the head steward, but ordered originally under the authority of the Treasury Office. She noted the visitors. And she noted, above everyone, the king's cousin. Victor Blackwood was charming the way winter sunlight is bright, all shine and no heat. He was in his 40s, silver at the temples, dressed always 1 degree finer than everyone else in the room. He ran the treasury, sat on the council, and was, as Marcus explained without being asked, next in the line of succession after Leo. He visited the medical wing twice a week, every week, bringing expensive toys, ruffling Leo's hair, telling the staff how the boy's recovery had lifted the whole family's heart. And every single time Victor entered the room, Grace's palms went cold. It was not proof. It was not anything she could take to a king. It was the same animal wrongness she felt in the amber syrup, a scent under his cologne, a residue on the air around his beautiful hands. She began keeping a notebook, hidden inside her mattress, written in the loose shorthand her grandmother had taught her. Dates of Victor's visits. Dates of tonic deliveries. The pattern held like a heartbeat. Deliveries followed his visits by 1 day, every time, for as far back as the pharmacy log recorded. Then came the evening that turned suspicion into certainty. Victor arrived with a gift, a bag of honey sweets from the capital, Leo's favorite, and he opened it and held one out to the boy with a warm uncle smile. Grace crossed the room without hurrying, without thinking, the way she had once crossed a kitchen toward a burning man, and intercepted the sweet with a laughing apology about the healer's strict diet, no sugar before evening medicine, doctor's orders. Her fingers closed around the little golden lump, and her senses opened, and there it was. Cold metal and dying flowers, packed into candy. Enough concentrated dose in that single sweet to undo 5 weeks of her work in one night. She looked up, still smiling her waitress smile, and found Victor watching her. Not glancing, watching. His eyes moved from the sweet in her closed hand to her face, and for the length of one heartbeat the charm dropped like a curtain, and Grace looked into the patient, calculating, absolutely unhurried gaze of the person who had murdered a queen. Then the curtain came back, and he was laughing, agreeing that healers know best, promising Leo the sweets would be waiting when he was stronger, wishing everyone a pleasant evening. He knew that she knew. She knew that he knew that she knew. Grace stood at Leo's window that night, long after the boy slept, watching Victor's lit study across the courtyard, understanding that the quiet phase of the war was over. She had taken his weapon, broken his timetable, and shown him her face. A man that patient, that careful, that close to a throne, would not simply stop. He would adjust. In his study, Victor sat with a glass in his hand, looking back at the dark window of the medical wing, and made a phone call to a private number in the Eastern Territories. When the line connected, he said only one sentence. He said, "Tell Silas his missing healer has been found." The warning came on a Tuesday, carved into her door. Grace had spent the morning with Leo in the garden, his first real outing in half a year, watching him chase a butterfly at a wobbling run, while Damien stood beside her pretending not to smile, and failing completely. It had been, by any measure, the best day since her arrival. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, reached for her door handle, and stopped. Deep, fresh cuts in the wood, letter by letter, at eye height. Leave, or fade like the Luna did. The corridor was empty. The palace hummed with its ordinary afternoon sounds, trolleys and distant voices and a vacuum somewhere below, and Grace stood alone in front of 6 carved words that confirmed everything and threatened everything. Fade like the Luna did. Not a phrase an outsider would choose. The person who wrote it was telling her plainly that Elena's death had been a killing, that they had done it, and that they could reach a locked door in the royal wing in daylight without being seen. It was not just a threat, it was a demonstration. Her room had been searched too, carefully, professionally, everything returned almost to its place, but Grace had lived 3 years as prey, and she noticed the almost. Her canvas bag re-zipped from the wrong end, her spare shoes swapped left to right, and her mattress, when she checked it with her heart hammering, held nothing. The notebook was gone. Every date, every pattern, every observation about the tonic and the visits, all of it now in the hands of the man it described. Her first instinct was the old one, the animal one. Run. The window, the wall, the highway, a bus, a new town, a new name. She had done it before, with less warning than this. Her hands were actually pulling the canvas bag from the wardrobe before she caught herself, before she stood very still in the middle of the room and made herself think. Running meant Leo died. It was that simple. The moment she left, the sweets and the syrup would resume, and this time the dose would not be patient, because Victor's timetable was broken and his cover was cracked, and rushed killers are the most dangerous kind. Running also meant the truth about Elena died with her, and the truth about whatever came next, because a man who has killed a queen and nearly killed a prince does not retire. He was next in line after Leo. There was one more name on that list after the boys. Running meant leaving Damien alive in a house with his murderer, and no one to tell him. And Grace discovered, standing there with the bag half out of the wardrobe, that somewhere in the last 5 weeks, the math of her life had changed without her permission. Her safety no longer sat alone on its side of the scale. There was a boy who called her Miss Grace and demanded exactly 3 stories and held her sleeve while he fell asleep. There was a scarred beta who had started calling her kid despite being barely 10 years older. There was a king who brought her coffee, black with 2 sugars, and had begun looking at her across his son's bed in a way that made the air feel thin. She put the bag back. Then she went to find Damien, because the time for lying to him was over. She told him everything in his private study with the doors locked and Marcus standing witness. The poison she had felt in Leo's blood that first day, the tonic, the nightly replacement of syrup, the pattern of deliveries, the sweet she had intercepted, which she had kept, wrapped in cloth, and now placed on his desk like a small golden bomb, the wrongness she felt around his cousin, the carved words on her door, and what fade like the Luna did meant, and what it meant about Elena. She watched the king turn to stone as she spoke, not the cold stone of his public face, something worse, something like a building, deciding whether to stand or come down. When she finished, the silence lasted so long that Marcus finally said his name softly. the way you might speak to a man standing near an edge. Damien's first words were quiet and almost gentle, which frightened her more than shouting would have. He asked how long she had known about the poison. "Since the first hour," she said, "since the first touch." He asked why she had said nothing, and Grace stood her ground and told him the truth. Because she had been a stranger with no name and no shield, alone in a fortress with a killer she could not identify, and the only advantage she had owned was that the killer did not know she existed. Silence had kept Leo alive. Silence had let her find the tonic. She had traded the king's trust for his son's heartbeat, and she would make the same trade again. Damien turned to the window, and his shoulders moved once, and when he spoke his voice had gravel in it. He said that for 2 years he had blamed himself for missing whatever illness took Elena. 2 years of reading medical texts at night, hunting for the thing he should have caught. And the whole time, someone at his table, someone who had carried her coffin, someone who had stood beside him at the grave with a hand on his shoulder, had done it with a steady hand and a pharmacy order. Then he said Victor's name, once, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. What followed was the hardest argument Grace had ever won. Damien wanted to walk down the corridor and end it, publicly, immediately, with his hands, and every wolf instinct in him was pulling the same direction. It took Grace and Marcus together, talking for an hour, to hold him, because they had a golden suite and a healer's word, and a pattern of dates, and Victor had 30 years of reputation, a council seat, allies in every institution, and now, thanks to the stolen notebook, full knowledge of exactly what evidence existed against him. Confront him today, and he would be shocked, wounded, gracious. The tonic would test clean, because he was not stupid. The supply line would already be sanitized, and the strange, nameless woman living beside the prince, the one with no documents and no past, would make a far more convincing villain to a nervous council than the king's own blood. If Damien moved without proof, Victor would not merely survive, he would win. So they built a trap instead, and the trap required the worst thing. It required pretending. Nothing changed, officially. Victor came twice a week with his gifts and his warmth, and Damien shook his hand and laughed at his jokes and did not tear his throat out, and Grace watched the effort of it turn the king gray around the eyes. Marcus, meanwhile, went hunting through paper. Quietly, through channels Victor did not control, he pulled 10 years of treasury records, pharmacy orders, travel logs, and private accounts, and slowly, thread by thread, the shape of it emerged. Payments to a chemical supplier in the Eastern Territories, disguised as equipment maintenance, beginning 3 years ago, months before Elena first fell ill. A private courier service on retainer, and repeated transfers, large ones, to a holding company that took Marcus 9 days to unmask, and when he did, he came to the study at 2 in the morning, and put the page in front of Damien and Grace without a word. The holding company belonged to the Eastern Pack, to its alpha. Grace read the name, and felt 3 years of nightmares stand up and walk toward her. Silas. She had to sit down. Then she had to talk, and for the first time, she gave Damien and Marcus her whole past, the pack she was born into, the discovery of her gift at 11, the years of being locked behind Silas's walls and drained like a well, healing his fighters, his allies, his paying clients, until the night she had slipped a fence and run into the dark with nothing. Silas had hunted her for a year before the trail went cold, and now his money was tangled through the palace treasury, and his silent partner had her stolen notebook, which held not just the poison pattern but, on its first page, in her grandmother's shorthand, her real full name. The pieces locked together with a sound only the 3 of them could hear. Victor supplied the throne's slow assassination. Silas supplied the poison and, in exchange, would collect a broken territory to carve up, and a bonus. He wanted more than gold. The healer who had humiliated him. The plan had been running for 3 years. Elena had been its first move. Leo was its second. And Grace, without knowing it, had walked directly into the center of the board. Marcus said they needed more time. 2 weeks, maybe 3, to trace the courier and put a living witness in front of the council. Someone whose testimony could not be dismissed. They did not get 2 weeks. 4 days later, a convoy of black vehicles arrived at the palace gates, flying the banner of the Eastern Pack, and Silas himself stepped out into the courtyard, smiling like a man arriving at his own birthday, and presented the gate guards with formal documents, requesting an immediate audience with the Alpha King on a matter of pack law. He had come to collect his property. The throne hall had not been used for a formal audience in 2 years, and it felt like a courtroom now, cold light falling through tall windows onto a floor polished like dark water. Damien sat the great chair with his counsel arranged to his right, Victor among them, composed and gleaming, and Grace stood to the left with Marcus, because Silas had demanded her presence by name, and refusing would have told him things they were not ready to have told. Silas had aged since she last saw him across a fence in the dark. He was leaner, grayer, more expensive, but the eyes were the same, flat and patient, the eyes of a man who had never once wanted a thing, without eventually holding it. When he entered the hall and saw her, he smiled, and Grace felt her body remember years of that smile, and it took everything her new life had built in her to stand still and lift her chin and give him nothing. His lawyer did the talking, at first. The claim was old law, the kind written in the border treaties a century ago and never repealed because no one decent had ever imagined using it. A pack member with a registered bloodline gift, the lawyer read, is bound in service to the pack of their birth, and their gift is pack property, transferable and recoverable. Grace Bennett, born Grace Ellison of the Eastern Pack, was a registered healer of that pack. She had absconded. The Eastern Pack formally demanded her return, and pack law, signed by both territories, gave them the right. The word property fell into the hall and lay there. Grace watched several council members shift in their seats. She watched Victor arrange his face into troubled sympathy, and understood exactly how this play was meant to run. Silas invokes the law. The council, cautious and legalistic, feels bound by treaty. Damien either surrenders her, losing his son's healer and breaking something in himself, or refuses, and hands Silas a legal grievance worth a war Victor would help lose from the inside. Either branch ended with Leo unprotected. It was elegant. It was probably Victor's design. Damien listened to the entire claim without moving. Then he said one word, no. The hall stirred. Silas's lawyer began citing treaty sections, and Damien cut him off without raising his voice, and what he said next was not, Grace realized, in any script Victor had planned for. He said that Grace Bennett had entered his territory as a free woman and was under his personal protection. He said that any law which defined a living person as recoverable property was a law he was formally repudiating in front of his council, effective immediately, and if the Eastern Pack disliked it, they were welcome to bring the matter before the regional assembly, where the Eastern Pack could explain in public how they had treated a child with a healing gift. And he said, finally, looking directly at Silas for the first time, that if any Eastern wolf touched her, treaty or no treaty, the response would not be legal in nature. Silas's smile did not move, but something behind it did. He gathered his documents, thanked the king for his clarity, and announced that under the treaty's dispute provisions, the Eastern Pack would return in 7 days for a final answer, after which all consequences would rest on the Blackwood name. He bowed with perfect courtesy. At the door, he paused, looked back at Grace, and told her, warmly, in front of the entire hall, that her old room was exactly as she left it. The 7 days that followed were the strangest of her life. War preparation wrapped around something that felt absurdly, unforgivably, like falling. The palace armed quietly. Marcus doubled the guard rotations with wolves he had vetted personally, moved Leo's rooms twice, and slept, as far as Grace could tell, never. The council met daily and fractured predictably, half of them backing the king's defiance, half of them, guided by Victor's gentle, reasonable poison, murmuring that no single woman, however useful, could be worth a border war, that perhaps a compromise, perhaps a negotiated service arrangement, perhaps. Victor himself was magnificent that week, tireless, loyal in every visible way, and twice Grace caught him watching her across a corridor with the curtain fully down, letting her see the patience underneath, letting her know that all of this was, to him, already finished. And through it all, Leo got stronger. That was the miracle no politics could touch. The last black threads were nearly gone now. He ran in the gardens, a real run, shouting, and climbed things he had no business climbing, and one golden afternoon he shifted for the first time in his life, tumbling into the shape of a gray wolf cub the size of a loaf of bread, so surprised by his own paws that he fell over sideways, and Damien laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unguarded that half the garden staff turned around to find its source. That night, after 3 stories and a negotiation that ended at 3.5, Leo fell asleep holding both their sleeves, one small fist for each of them, and Grace and Damien sat trapped and unmoving on either side of the bed for an hour, and their eyes met over the sleeping boy, and neither looked away, and no one said anything, and everything was said. It was Grace who broke first, on the 6th night. The deadline sat on the morning like a stone. She found Damien on the balcony where Marcus had once feared for him, and she told him the thing she had been carrying all week. She knew what surrender would cost her, she said, and she knew exactly what life inside Silas's walls was, and she would go anyway, tonight, quietly, if it meant no war came here. She had done the arithmetic. 1 person against a border in flames. Against Leo growing up in a fortress under siege, the math only came out one way, and she would not be able to live inside her own skin, as the woman whose freedom was bought with other people's children. Damien listened to all of it in silence. Then he turned, and took her face in both hands, carefully, as if she were something that had already been broken once by careless handling, and told her that her arithmetic was wrong, because she had valued herself at 0, and that was the one number he would not accept. He said he had stood in this palace twice, while someone he loved was taken from him slowly, and he had been helpless both times, and he was not helpless now, and he would burn the treaty, the border, and his own crown, before he watched it happen a 3rd time. She heard the word love arrive in that sentence, unannounced, undeniable. So did he. He did not take it back. She kissed him, or he kissed her, and afterward, neither could have said which, and it did not matter. The wind moved over the balcony, and below them, the palace lay strung with watchfires, and for the length of that one night, the war, and the deadline, and the patient man in the fine clothes did not exist. She stayed. They talked until the sky went pale, about Elena, about her grandmother, about yellow fields and diners, and every mile of road that had somehow been leading here. And Grace understood that she had finally lost the ability to run, not because walls held her, but because for the first time in her life, nothing was chasing her out, and everything was calling her in. The 7th morning came bright and cold. Silas's convoy was due at noon. At 10, Marcus knocked on the study door with a courier's envelope in his hand and a strange expression on his face. The trace on Victor's private courier had finally landed. They had found the man, and the man, facing what Marcus described as a frank conversation about his future, had talked, and then had handed over his insurance, the records he had secretly kept of 3 years of deliveries, dates, contents, signatures, including one delivery, 3 years ago this month, of a sealed package from an Eastern chemical supplier, signed for personally, in his own elegant hand, by Victor Blackwood, 10 days before the Queen's first symptom. It was everything. It was the thread that unraveled the whole cloth. Marcus wanted to move immediately, arrest Victor before the convoy arrived, cut the conspiracy's head off an hour before its partner walked in the gate. Damien stood at the window for a long moment, looking down at the courtyard where the reception was being prepared, and Grace saw the strategist wake behind his eyes. "No," he said slowly. "Not before the convoy arrives. After. Let Silas walk in believing his partner is intact, and his trap is closing. Let Victor stand in that hall feeling the crown within reach of his fingers." They had spent weeks, as the only side that knew there was a war. This afternoon, in front of the full council and the Eastern delegation, both conspirators would learn, in the same moment, in public, that they had lost. It was a good plan. It was a clean, just, satisfying plan, and standing in the warm morning light, with the evidence finally in their hands, all 3 of them believed in it. None of them knew that the previous night, while the palace slept and 2 people talked until dawn on a balcony, Victor had stood in Leo's doorway for a long quiet minute, watching the boy sleep, and had decided that patience had failed and the schedule was now his own. The banquet to receive the Eastern delegation was set for noon. Victor had already chosen the cup. The banquet hall glittered like a trap dressed as a celebration, which is exactly what both sides believed it to be, each certain the trap was theirs. Long tables ran the length of the room under iron chandeliers. The Eastern delegation sat along one side, Silas at their center in wine-dark formal wear, gracious and glittering and flat-eyed. The Blackwood Council faced them. Damien held the head of the table with Leo seated proudly at his right, because tradition demanded the heir's presence at treaty receptions, and because, in truth, No one had believed the boy safer anywhere else than in a hall full of allies, 3 feet from his father, with Grace directly across from him and Marcus's vetted guards on every door. That belief was the mistake. Grace could barely eat. The courier's evidence sat in a sealed folder in Marcus's coat, waiting for the moment after the formal toasts when Damien would rise, and everything would come down at once. She ran the plan through her head again and again, and in between she watched, the old habit, the waitress's habit, tracking every plate and glass and pair of hands in the room. Leo's food had come through her own hands as always. His cup she had poured herself from the common pitcher and set at his place with her own fingers. The boy was giggling at something, kicking his feet under the table, wearing his little formal jacket like a soldier's uniform, thrilled to be included in the grown world. The toasts began. Silas rose first, silk-voiced, praising old treaties and new understandings, and lifted his glass, and the hall lifted with him, 100 arms in motion at once, servers stepping forward along the tables to refill, and clear in the customary flurry, bodies crossing between every sightline in the room, for the length of 8 seconds. 8 seconds. Grace would replay them for the rest of her life. A server's sleeve passing behind Leo's chair, the chandelier light catching on glass. Victor, 4 seats down, not looking at the boy at all, laughing at a councilman's remark, his hands in plain view, because Victor's hands were always in plain view. That had never been how he worked. The pass had already happened somewhere upstream, in a kitchen, in a corridor, in a pitcher, in the 8 seconds or the 8 minutes before, purchased from some hand Marcus had vetted and Victor had priced. Grace's palms went cold, that old cold, the metal and dying flowers cold, and her eyes dropped to Leo's cup just as the boy, toasting like the grown-ups with his watered juice, drank it to the bottom. She was moving before her chair hit the floor. The hall was still mid-toast, glasses still raised, and the healer was suddenly running down the length of the royal table, and then Leo made a small, confused sound, and pressed his hand to his chest, and his cup rolled off the table, and rang against the stone, and the world came apart. The dose was not patient this time. It was not the slow silver thread of 3 years of caution. It was massive, brutal, a killing flood, and it hit the little body all at once. Leo folded sideways into his father's arms, with his lips already going gray, and Damien was shouting his name, and the hall was on its feet, chairs going over, guards flooding inward, the Eastern delegation recoiling in what was either shock or theater, and Grace reached the boy and got her hands on his chest, and opened her senses, and nearly screamed at what she found. The darkness was everywhere at once, an ocean where there had been threads, dragging the small bright core of him down so fast she could feel it dimming under her palms like a coal in water. She poured the gift in, and held him at the edge. It took everything she had just to hold him there, to keep the light from going under, and she understood immediately, with a healer's terrible clarity, that holding was all she could do. Drawing this much out would take hours, and a depth of giving she could not survive, and it could not be done here, on a banquet table, in the middle of a stampede. And then, through the chaos, came the voice, calm, carrying, pitched perfectly to cut through panic, the voice of a man who had rehearsed, Victor, standing, pointing, his handsome face a mask of dawning horror, saying the words he had been saving for 3 years, seize her. The woman had prepared every meal, poured every cup, controlled every drop that reached the prince for weeks, a nameless drifter, with no past, who had refused all oversight, and the moment the Eastern Pack exposed her true identity, and came to claim her, the boy is poisoned at her own table. Seize her before she finishes what she came to do. It was beautiful. It was airtight. It was the trap inside the trap, and Grace felt it close around her, exactly as designed. Silas was on his feet now too, sorrowfully confirming that the woman had a history, that his pack had expelled her over dangerous conduct, the 2 liars interlocking their stories in front of a terrified council like gears. Guards hesitated, looking from the king to the healer with her hands on the dying prince, and in that hesitation, Grace saw how it would go, and how it had to go, and she made the choice in the space of 1 heartbeat. If she fought the accusation now, in this chaos, Leo died on this table while adults argued. There was only one move that kept the boy alive, and kept her hands free later, and it was surrender. She looked across Leo's body at Damien, straight into the gray eyes, and told him low and fast, under the roar of the hall, the only things that mattered. The dose was in the cup, and the cup was not hers past the pitcher. The boy needed a stabilizing hold every hour that only she could give, and he needed to trust her one more time and let this happen. Then she lifted her hands from Leo's chest, stepped back from the table, and let the guards take her arms. The hall roared. Somewhere Silas was demanding her transfer into Eastern custody as a criminal of his pack, and Victor was seconding it with grave reluctance. The last elegant stroke, out of these walls and into their hands forever. And for one endless second, the entire conspiracy balanced on whether a shattered father, holding his poisoned son, cradling the second dying child of his life, would think or break. Damien looked at his boy, then at Grace between the guards, then at his cousin's perfect grieving face, and Grace watched something behind the king's eyes go very cold and very quiet, and he did not break. He ordered the hall sealed. "No one," he said, in a voice that stopped the room like a dropped blade, "leaves the palace, not the delegation, not the council, not the staff, no one, until his son's poisoner is found. The prince would be moved to the medical wing, under triple guard. And the healer," he said, not looking at Victor, "would be held, secured, here, in the palace cells, under Blackwood authority alone, pending investigation. And any man of any pack who tried to remove her from his territory would be treated as an invader." It split the difference with surgical precision, and only 3 people in that hall knew it was not grief flailing but a move on a board. Grace let herself be led away through the wreckage of the banquet, past Silas's rigid smile, past Victor, and as she passed him their eyes met for the last time as pretenders, and she gave him a look that carried one message. "I know it was the pitcher. I know you own a guard, and you have no idea what is in Marcus's coat." They put her in a stone cell beneath the palace, and the door closed, and Grace sat down on the narrow bunk in the dark, and did the only work left to her. She slowed her breath, gathered what remained of her strength for the drawing out that was coming, whether it killed her or not, and counted the minutes in Leo's failing hour, trusting the 2 men above her to move the final piece. Above, in the sealed and seething palace, Damien stood over his son's bed, laid the courier's folder on the blanket, and told Marcus to bring him his cousin. Victor came to the medical wing willingly, which was his final miscalculation. He arrived composed and sorrowful, flanked by 2 council members he had spent years cultivating, prepared for a grieving cousin's questions, prepared to console, to advise, to gently steer the investigation toward the woman in the cells. He had rehearsed this conversation for 3 years. He had rehearsed the wrong one. Damien stood beside Leo's bed. The boy lay gray and shallow-breathed under the lamps, alive only because of the hold Grace had poured into him at the table, a candle guttering in a sealed room. The king did not greet his cousin. He simply opened the courier's folder on the table, turned it around, and said one word: "Explain." Grace heard none of it from her cell, but Marcus told her afterward how it went, and she made him tell it twice. The delivery records with Victor's signature, 10 days before Elena's first symptom. The payment trail to the Eastern chemical supplier dressed as equipment maintenance. The transfers to Silas's holding company, dated and itemized across 3 years. The courier himself, alive, secured, and singing. Page after page, laid down one at a time in silence, while the 2 escorting council members read over Victor's shoulder, and slowly, visibly, stepped away from him, the way men step back from a downed power line. Victor tried. That was the thing about him, Marcus said. Even then, even buried, he tried, voice smooth as ever, questioning the documents, questioning the courier's character, constructing reasonable doubt out of air, and he was actually gaining ground, actually watching one councilman begin to nod, when the door opened, and Dr. Hale walked in carrying the banquet pitcher wrapped in cloth, and beside him walked a young guard named Peter Wells, one of the vetted door guards from the hall, white as chalk, who had spent 1 hour in a room with Marcus and had chosen his own life. The guard's confession pulled the last stone out of the wall. Victor had paid him a month ago, small errands first, then larger, then, 3 nights passed, a vial and an instruction and a sum of money that would have bought his silence forever if his nerve had held. He had emptied the vial into the prince's pitcher during the toast confusion, exactly as directed, and Victor had stood 4 seats away with his hands in plain view, laughing at a councilman's joke, while his money did the work. The composure went out of Victor Blackwood all at once, and what was left underneath, Marcus said, was the truly frightening thing, because it was not rage, and it was not fear. It was grievance. 30 years of it. He had been the elder cousin, the cleverer one, the one who ran the treasury while Damien inherited a throne by accident of birth. Elena had been carrying a second child when she died. Did Damien know that? A second heir, a second lock on a door that should have been Victor's. And he spoke of her death the way a man speaks of correcting a ledger. He confessed to all of it, standing straight in his fine clothes, because in his mind it required no confession, only explanation, the strong take. He had simply been strong slowly. Damien listened to the whole account of his wife's murder without moving. Then he pronounced it. Victor Blackwood was stripped of name, seat, and blood claim, and would be held for the Regional Assembly's justice. Full public trial, every record open, so that every pack in the region would know exactly what he was. No quiet end, no dignity of legend. He would live a long time, Damien said quietly, as a lesson. They were the last words the cousins ever exchanged. As the guards took him out, Victor passed close to the king and said one thing more, softly, smiling, and Marcus, who heard it, said, "It stopped his own blood." He said, "Check the boy's cup again, cousin. Silas mixes it stronger than I ever did. You caught the traitor and lost the child. The trade was always going to end this way." The eastern convoy was already moving. Silas had watched the palace seal itself, read the arithmetic in an instant, and chosen flight over theater, his vehicles rolling for the border, while the council was still shouting. Marcus took 12 wolves and hunted him down in the gray hours before dawn, and what happened at the border crossing was short. Silas's guards, career men paid in a coin their alpha was about to lose, looked at the Blackwood wolves, looked at their employer, and stood aside. Silas was taken at the checkpoint with a briefcase full of foreign currency, and the second vial, the insurance dose, still sealed in his coat, and that vial, meant for a 5-year-old's cup if the first one somehow failed, ended any argument any assembly would ever hear on his behalf. The Eastern Pac's own council, scenting the wind, renounced him before the sun was fully up. It was over. Both of them, taken alive, broken on paper, finished. The palace had its truth, the queen had her justice, and none of it mattered at all, because Victor's parting words were simply accurate. Upstairs, the candle was going out. They brought Grace up from the cells at a run. No apology, no ceremony, Damien himself unlocking the door, and she read his face, and was moving before it opened fully. In the medical wing she put her hands on Leo's chest and dove, and surfaced a minute later, with the truth she had already known at the banquet table, and had spent her hours in the dark preparing to meet. The ocean of poison was consuming him. Machines could not filter it, medicine could not bind it, and time would not dilute it. It could be drawn out, all of it, in one continuous working, hours long, through her own body, and the arithmetic of that was very simple, and she recited none of it aloud. She only asked for the room to be cleared of everyone but Damien and Marcus, for water, and for a chair. Damien caught her arm. He had not slept. He had lost his wife's ghost and his cousin, and very nearly his son in a single day, and he was nobody's fool, and he asked her the question directly. What would this cost her? And Grace, who had lied to this man once, in this room, on her first day, about this same poison, found she could not do it twice. She told him the truth. Everything she had. Possibly more than she had. There was a line in Deep Healing Past, which the healer's own light gets pulled into the dark, along with what she is drawing out. And she would be working past that line for hours. And her grandmother had told her once that their gift would someday ask for everything. And she had spent her whole life running from that day. And it was here, and she was not running. He said no. He said it the way he had said it to Silas in the throne hall. Absolute. A king's no. And then his voice cracked and it was just a man's. And he said he could not do this again. Could not hold one more person he loved while the light went out. And there it was. The word. Spoken plainly at last. In front of Marcus. In front of the sleeping boy. In the worst hour of both their lives. Grace took his face in her hands the way he had once taken hers on the balcony. She told him that for 3 years she had stayed alive by making herself small, by mattering to no one, and it had worked, and it had been its own kind of death. These last weeks, in this cold stone house full of danger, she had finally mattered, been trusted, been loved, and she understood now what her grandmother had really meant. The gift would ask for everything, and on that day, she would find out who she was. She knew who she was. She was the woman who was not going to watch that little boy die while she had the water in her hands. She kissed him once. Then she sat down beside the bed, rolled up her sleeves, and placed both palms on Leo's small chest, and Damien did the hardest thing of his reign. He stood back and let her begin. The last thing Marcus did before the long night started was open the curtains, so that whatever happened in that room would happen facing east, toward the coming sun. The working began at midnight, and for the first hour it looked almost gentle. Grace sat straight-backed in the chair, eyes closed, hands resting on Leo's chest, and the only signs of the war underneath were the sweat at her hairline and the slow, steady climb of color into the boy's gray face, as if she were pouring dawn into him one drop at a time. Damien stood at the foot of the bed and did not move. Marcus guarded the door from the inside and watched the 2 heartbeats on the monitors, the small one strengthening, minute by minute, and he tried not to understand where the strength was coming from. By the second hour, Grace had stopped looking like a woman resting her hands on a child, and started looking like a woman holding a rope over a cliff edge with something enormous on the other end. Her arms trembled. Her breath came in a laborer's rhythm, deep and driven. The poison did not want to leave. Silas's dose was a different make from Victor's slow silver threads, cruder, hungrier, and it fought her for every inch, and she pulled it anyway, drawing the darkness up out of the boy's blood and through her own body in long, agonizing hauls, burning what she could and carrying the rest. She passed her own limit somewhere in the 3rd hour. She knew the line when she crossed it, the line her grandmother had warned her about, the point where the gift stops spending strength and starts spending self. It felt like stepping off a floor she had stood on all her life. She heard, very distantly, the second monitor, her monitor, the one Marcus had insisted on clipping to her finger, begin to slow. She heard Damien say her name, once, in a voice with fear in it, and she gathered enough surface to speak and told him not to stop her. Whatever he saw, whatever the machines said, because stopping now would leave the poison loose in both of them and finish them both. Then she went back down. The 4th hour was the field. She was aware, in some far-off way, that her body was still in the chair, that her hands were still on Leo's chest, that hands, Damien's hands, were braced on her shoulders now, holding her upright, breaking his promise not to touch, and keeping the more important one not to stop her. But Grace herself was somewhere else. She stood in a meadow of yellow flowers under a white sky, and the meadow was the boy, the deep bright core of him, and the darkness came through the flowers like floodwater, and she stood in it, and gathered it, and sent it away, armful after armful, hour after hour, while the water rose past her knees, her waist, her chest. She was not alone there. She never told anyone the whole of this part, not even Damien, not for years. A woman stood at the edge of the field, dark-haired, warm-eyed, dressed for summer, and Grace knew her from 100 palace portraits. Elena did not speak in words that could be carried back, but she stood witness, all through the flood, and near the end, when Grace's own light was flickering, and the last of the darkness was clinging to the roots of the field, and Grace no longer remembered why she should not simply lie down in the water. The woman came across the flowers, and knelt with her, and put her hands under Grace's hands, and Grace understood 2 things at once: that she was being helped by something the living have no name for, and that she was being thanked, and asked, and entrusted, all in one gesture, mother to mother, though Grace had never been one. Take care of them, both of them. Finish this, and take care of them. Grace pulled the last of the poison out of the roots of the yellow field, at 17 minutes past 5 in the morning. In the medical wing, the machines told the story in 2 voices. Leo's monitor settled into the strong, easy rhythm of a healthy sleeping child, his skin warm, his lips pink, his small chest rising and falling without effort, for the first time in half a year. Clean. Entirely clean. Saved. And in the same minute, in the same breath, Grace's hands slid from his chest, and her monitor stuttered, and stalled, and cried out its single unbroken tone, and she folded sideways out of the chair into Damien's arms, with her eyes closed, and her heart still. What happened in the next 3 minutes, Dr. Hale would spend the rest of his career failing to explain. He had been waiting outside the door all night, and he came through it at the alarm with his team, and they worked on the young woman on the floor with everything medicine had, and medicine had nothing. because there was nothing wrong with her body that a body could fix. The vessel was sound, the light was gone, spent, poured out to the last of itself into the boy on the bed. Hale would say afterward, only to Marcus, only once, that he had felt like a mechanic trying to repair a lamp that was unplugged. It was Leo who woke. Perhaps it was the alarm, perhaps the loss of the hands, that had held him all night. The boy sat up in bed, clear-eyed, restored, and looked down at the scene on the floor, his father on his knees, the doctors falling still one by one, the healer lying quiet in the lamplight, and Leo did not scream, and did not cry. He climbed down from the bed with the terrible calm of a child doing something he has been told to do, walked through the frozen adults, and knelt, and took Grace's hand in both of his. He said, "Mama showed me. In the field," she said, "when the lady gives you the light, you have to give some back. That is the rule of the field." And the room filled with the smell of summer flowers. What passed from the boy's hands was small. It was a spark against the ocean she had given him, a single coal handed back from a fire she had built with her whole self. But a spark on the right tinder is enough. Grace's monitor caught it, stumbled over it, and found a beat. Then another. The doctors surged back in, around a heart that had changed its mind. And this time medicine had something to work with, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern wall and came through the curtains Marcus had opened, Grace Bennett was alive, barely, faintly, but alive, with a 5-year-old boy holding her hand and refusing all instructions to let go. She did not wake that day, or the next. For 3 days, she lay in the deep place between, her body healing a wound no chart had a word for, and the palace reorganized itself around her room, as if around a chapel. Damien did not leave. He held her hand through the days, and talked to her through the nights, out loud, past caring who heard, telling her about the trial dates set for Victor and Silas, about the Eastern Pact's new decent leadership suing for peace, about the council's unanimous vote of honors for the healer, about Leo's appetite, about nothing, about everything, about the balcony, about the arithmetic of her worth, which he intended to spend a lifetime correcting. Leo was smuggled in past every rule twice a day, and finally simply assigned himself there, doing his lessons on the floor of her room, and it was Leo, on the third evening, mid-complaint about arithmetic of his own, who looked up and stopped, because Grace's eyes were open, and she was watching them both, and she was smiling. The first thing she said, in a voice like a whisper through dry grass, was that somebody had better be watching the diner, because Rosie would kill her if she lost her job over this. Damien laughed, and it broke in the middle, and he pressed his forehead to her hand, and the Alpha King of the Blackwood territory wept without shame in front of his son, and Leo climbed onto the bed into the space between them where he had always belonged, and outside the window the evening came down gold over the palace, and for the first time in 3 years, in that whole cold stone house, nothing anywhere was fading. The trials came with the autumn, and Grace stood through both of them. She was stronger by then, though the deep working had left its mark on her, a white streak in her dark hair at the temple, and a stillness behind her eyes that had not been there before, the look of someone who has seen the far side of a field and come back. She testified before the regional assembly with her real name, her full name, spoken aloud in public for the first time in 3 years, Grace Ellison Bennett, and she told them everything, the tonic, the threads, the sweet, the pitcher, the long night, and the assembly listened in a silence you could stand on. Victor was condemned by every pack in the region and sent to live out his long lesson in a northern facility, with his name struck from the Blackwood rolls, and he never spoke another word in public, not at sentencing, not ever, and Grace found she felt nothing when they let him out, which she decided was its own kind of healing. Silas received the same, and worse, because his own former pack members came forward one after another, healers, laborers, people he had used and discarded across 30 years, drawn out of hiding by the news that someone had finally stood up in the open and said his name. Grace met them in the assembly corridors, a dozen runners like herself who had thought they were the only ones, and something began there in those corridors that would take years to finish growing. The old law died that winter. Damien carried the repeal to the regional assembly personally, the property clause and every treaty like it, and after the testimony they had all heard, not one pack voted to keep it. They named the repeal the Ellison Act, over Grace's strenuous objection, and Marcus told her to stop arguing and let history spell her name right for once. Spring came, and with it the question the whole territory had been asking for months, in kitchens and guard rooms and council chambers, with wagers attached. Damien asked it in the yellow field. He took her east of the palace on a bright cold morning in April, on the excuse of showing her something, and the something was the meadow in first bloom, gold to the horizon, Elena's meadow, Leo's field, the place Grace had stood in the hour of the flood, real under her feet at last. Leo was in on it, of course, bouncing like a kettle about to boil, and it was Leo who officially asked, because he had demanded the job and would not be refused, planting himself in the flowers and announcing that he and his papa had discussed it, and they would like her to be his mama and the queen, in that order of importance. And then Damien knelt in the gold with his mother's ring, and Grace, laughing and ruined and certain, said yes to them both. She was crowned Luna of the Blackwood territory, on the first day of summer, in the throne hall where Silas had once called her property. The hall was packed beyond its walls, packs from every border. The Eastern delegation in the front rows under their new alpha, Rosie from the diner, in her best dress crying into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth, Danny beside her wearing the healed arm that had started it all, and Dr. Hale, who had asked for no honor except a seat where he could see her face. Marcus stood as witness. Leo carried the crown on its cushion, with the gravity of a boy carrying the sun, and when Damien set it on her head and turned her to face the hall, the roar that came back off the stone was heard. The guards swore afterward, all the way to the town. The waitress from Millbrook was queen, but that was never the ending, because Grace had made a promise in a field between worlds, and a queen has resources a runner never had. She bought the diner. Rosie sold it to her for $1 and a permanent invitation to the palace at Christmas, and Grace rebuilt it, kept the counter, kept the pie case, kept Danny on as manager, and opened the rooms above and behind it as something the territory had never seen, a school, a haven, a place where people with gifts like hers, the hidden ones, the hunted ones, the ones drained by packs like Silas's and taught by hard experience to trust no one, could come in off the highway and learn what her grandmother had never had the safety to teach in full, how to heal without being emptied, how to hold the line her grandmother spoke of and know its cost, how to be powerful and remain a person. The Ellison Act protected them in law now, the Bennett School, people called it, though the sign outside still said Rosie's, and Grace never changed it, because she wanted every frightened runner who walked in to see a diner, not an institution, and to be handed pie before paperwork. They came. First in ones, then in dozens. A boy from the coast who could knit bone, and had been sleeping in bus stations. Twin sisters from the mountains, who had been rented out by their pack like equipment. An old man, who had hidden his hands for 50 years. Grace taught them all, and the ones she taught began teaching, and within a few years, there were healers, free healers, salaried and protected and rested, in clinics across 4 territories, and children who would once have faded in white beds, while doctors found nothing, were going home. Dr. Hale, before he retired, co-wrote the first medical protocols in the region's history for working alongside gifted healers, and dedicated the text to a patient he identified only as L. Leo grew. He grew tall and quick and kind, and he grew into his own strange spark, the coal handed back on the medical wing floor, which had taken root in him and become a small, steady gift of his own. And Grace trained him herself, evenings in the palace garden, the crown prince of the Blackwood territory learning the rule of the field, from the woman who had proved it. He never called her anything but Mama after the coronation. On the anniversary of the long night, every year, the 3 of them went to the Yellow Meadow together, and stayed until the stars came out, and what was said there stayed there. And once a year, on an ordinary weekday with no announcement, the Luna of the Blackwood territory drove east alone, tied on an apron, and worked a full shift at the counter of a highway diner, pouring coffee for truckers and tired families who mostly never recognized her, and occasionally, wonderfully, did. She said it kept her honest. She said you could learn everything worth knowing about people from behind a coffee pot. Damien came along some years and sat in the corner booth like any road-weary traveler, watching his queen laugh with strangers, and always ordered the same thing, black coffee, 2 sugars, and always left a tip that made Danny shake his head. On one of those shifts, years on, a girl came in off the last bus of the night, 17 maybe, hollow-eyed, road-worn, holding her hands curled against her body, The way you hold a secret that has already cost you everything. Grace set a slice of pie in front of her unasked, and said it was on the house. The girl looked up with the old animal wariness, the look Grace knew from the inside of her own skin, and asked why, and asked, in a voice gone rough from disuse, whether it was true what people said about this place, that the woman here was like her once, hunted for what her hands could do, and that she had ended up a queen. Grace poured her a cup of coffee, sat down across the booth the way no one had ever sat down for her, and smiled. She said the story was mostly true, but people always told it wrong. They told it like the miracle was that a waitress became a queen. That was not the miracle. The miracle was the night a frightened woman, with every reason to run, stood in a field, with the water rising, and did not put down what she was carrying. Crowns, she said, were just what the world hands you afterward, when it finally notices what you were worth all along. Then she nodded at the girl's curled hands, slid the pie a little closer, and said the words that had once been said, in one way or another, to her. You are safe here. You are not a thing to be owned. And whenever you are ready, there is a great deal of work to do.